Hi, my name is Helen, and I've written a book called Moving Forwards, Working Backwards, a Strengths-Based Approach to Neurodivergence. One of the motivations for writing that book was as I worked with many neurodivergent clients and over years discovered just how many neurodivergent people there are in my life, including myself. I became increasingly concerned about pathologizing language. This is just one aspect of what I'd like to talk about today. But we've had a literal explosion of people exploring that they may be on the autistic spectrum, that they may be what I call ADH, usually looking for a diagnosis of ADD since psychiatrists in their wisdom disappeared ADHD as an alternative some years before. Uh, this is the way I look at it. If you're making some discoveries about yourself, and I feel very passionately about a strengths-based approach, not just lip service. I think we start with language. So if you're hearing from somebody that they're describing you with words like deficit or disorder, I just don't see how that's going to make you feel better about yourself. The whole point of understanding the different ways our brains are wired or the different ways we are in the world is to help us grow and feel better about ourselves, as far as I'm concerned. So, in the world we live in, and especially over the last couple of decades, we've got a long way to go, but we've realized that there are dominant paradigms that people consciously or unconsciously compare themselves to and usually come up with a shortfall, often feeling a lot of self-hatred and shame at its extreme. So I'm not going to really go into a lot of that, but just to point out some examples where we're seeing empowerment movements over decades. Uh, we see this with LGBTQI people and even the gradual inclusion of the different ways of being in the world in that description, recognizing that all those identities are valid and not just being compared to the dominant paradigm of heterosexuality. Same with race, class, all kinds of things, abilities. So it's fairly clear that for a long time there are people who are neurodivergent who are very recognizable. All human behavior is on a continuum. So clearly there are people who need to be more supported because their struggles are more obvious and more intense in terms of making adjustments. And this is where it gets tricky to the world that they live in, which often really hasn't made a lot of space for them. And I'll talk about that further down the track. But also just to make adjustments so that they have a better quality of life. So, for instance, if you can't walk, then having some assistance like a wheelchair or some other aids obviously is going to increase your independence and quality of life. So the people that I'm talking about, I think, are the ones that we don't often see referenced and represented as neurodivergent. We're everywhere. If you start seeing what I'm about to discuss, of course, there'll be your favorite TV shows that this applies to. There's characters on there that are neurodivergent but have never been considered so. Now, I love the increase of representation of all people. An example on the ABC would be The Assembly, where autistic trainee journalists are interviewing famous people. That's great. And it's also lovely to see as they get more confident and their anxiety reduces, then their skills level and engagement go up. Nevertheless, I would say that all, if not the majority of people who are autistic on that show, you have a stronger sense of their difference. There are whole generations of neurodivergent people who just aren't recognised, and that's what I'd like to talk about, as well as continuing to press the point about language. Women and girls, as we're hearing very commonly now, haven't been recognised because when the assessments of ADD and ADHD children first started appearing, and I remember as a younger psychologist, that was back in it became a really growing movement. I remember in the early 90s as a child and family psychologist, I was being referred a whole lot of ADHD kids, nearly all boys, some straight to medication from their paediatrician, some with a more balanced and systemic view where they were working with a whole lot of other support, including family therapy and behavioural support at school, etc. So, I feel like I've kind of lived through some of those changes, and it really was a common idea that it was largely boys we were referring to. So it's a relatively new recognition that girls, and of course generations of women who were missed, fit an ADH description. So I might just say what I mean by that and why I feel so strongly we need to change language. Attention deficit disorder is what we're working with at the moment. I passionately hate that description, and the one I would prefer to use is attention divergent. That could be enough. I put H on there in my book, ADH, as a shorthand for highly sensitive. So often ADHs are highly sensitive people. I see a Venn diagram here, and unfortunately we live in a medical and psychological world that historically again compartmentalizes and pathologizes. So there can be highly sensitive people who aren't neurodivergent. I would say that all ADHs are highly sensitive, and if I don't get a move on, that's probably going to be a topic for another podcast. So changing the language. Attention divergent reflects the common experience of ADHs where our brains are going in many different directions, and that can be an enormous strength. Now I see more of this in myself, and it's taken me into my 60s to realise it applies to me, and like many, many people of my generation, working backwards, my son being recognised, and then a whole lot of other people in my family, especially in that generation, and then going, hang on, let's have another look at how ADH women experience themselves in the world. And so there we are, often the kids who were either chatterboxes, who couldn't stop talking or blurting out things, or daydreamers who were always off somewhere else, off with the fairies, is a description I often remember, where our highly active brains needed to be fed. Yes, feeding the dopamine heat. But although we're often the kids who had the report cards that said, not living up to our potential, easily distracted, talks too much in class, that kind of thing. It was never put together with our brains are wired differently, and so often we would underperform as little boys frequently do as well, because if we weren't interested in what was being presented, we were going to go off into our flights of fancy. When ADHs find what they're passionate about, they often can be highly focused, even hyper-focused. My son's downstairs at the moment, and his intense focus on writing and producing his music is amazing. I have to remind him to take a break because he is so absorbed in that activity, whereas at school, there was so much he wasn't interested in, and he just flew under the radar, partly because he didn't fit the profile of common ADH boys, where he wasn't naughty, he didn't disrupt, he wasn't a chatterbox in school, he didn't want to get into trouble, so he masked. And we often talk about masking with autism, but of course ADH is masked too unconsciously. So let me just flip over to talk about ASs. This is my shorthand for people on the autistic spectrum. I know autism in itself still has a stigma. Someone told me the other day that people that she knows are much happier about hearing that they're ADD than autistic. I think that's a real shame. In my book, I talk about whatever language you want to use should be yours. Asperger's, that was usually referred to what I think of as highly adaptable people. Again, if we say high functioning, we're still comparing to a neurotypical norm. And as soon as we start comparing to something that's normal, we in effect say that the other group, whoever we're referring to, is not as good, is less than. I think that's not the intention, but that's how it comes across. It's what makes people mask. So if you're a highly adapted autistic person or ADHD, or, and this is where it gets really interesting, both, then people, unless they're very close to you, and then there's often a whole lot of what I call a cluster effect. So, everyone wants a checklist. And it's like, oh, look at this checklist. I had someone I've worked with for years say to me the other day, every time I went to the checklists about ADD, that didn't apply to me. And now I believe you. You raised it a couple of years ago. I don't want to impose that on him or anyone else. But for me, it's been so liberating to find another way to understand myself and many people I love, that it's something, if it seems applicable, I'd like to share. People are too caught up in stigma, which is often that underlying negative response. I don't want to be that because I see it as bad or less than. You mightn't have those words, but that's the message you get if something's been stigmatized. Then, basically it can take a long time, like myself and many others, to discover the truth and the strengths in it. So to come back to Dualies, I didn't make up that word. I got that word from a client. Thanks, Jess. And at first I thought she was talking about a woman's name. Sorry, they were talking about a woman's name. However, Dualies, very important territory, because the more I work with people, the more I've come to understand that there are a lot more Dualies around than we realise. And one of the reasons we don't realise is that if people get a diagnosis, which I'd like to call a recognition of their neurodivergence, the people who make those assessments often only stop at the more obvious one. I have to say, even though I'm maybe shot down in flames, that a huge number of medical professionals, especially psychiatrists, I don't think are very skilled in this area. Perhaps it's fair to say that none of us were not so long ago. And there's a whole movement of people who are now exploring it more positively. However, I guess as long as I've been a psychologist, which is 40 years, it's always concerned me that the psychiatric profession in particular uses pathologizing language for all kinds of struggles and concerns that people have, which I don't think are particularly helpful. Let's get rid of the disorders and perhaps find language that explains more in a positive way who this person is. So in my book, I developed an analogy for Julie's, which is the penny farthing bike, because there's a lot of tension between being both. like in my Venn diagram model, of course, there's overlap. There is overlap between AS and ADH. There's overlap with trauma or being a highly sensitive person or being, I'm going to forget all the different circles in my Venn diagram. I will come back to that and I'll also upload it as I'm getting this thing moving. But my point is that they're not the same, and we need to recognize the different components and how they work together and how they might create some internal struggle in a person. So commonly now with my neurodivergent clients who are recognizing their Dualies, we'll talk about which is your big wheel. Which wheel do you lead with? In a penny farthing bike, the big wheel comes first, but you still need that little wheel to be able to move yourself along easily. I think it's a very exciting field that we really haven't explored enough, that ADHs and ASs are very drawn to each other. And that just hasn't happened in the last few years. That's been happening probably for centuries. But again, in the field of high adaptability, we haven't realized it. This is something that's genetic. And in my next podcast, I'll talk about how that's probably come about. We can only talk about hypotheses, not facts. But if there's been good reasons why ADHs and ASs are drawn to each other, then with a significant proportion of primary relationships that have the genetics for both, we're going to get more and more children who at least hold the genetics for both. Now, this isn't perfect science. It isn't black and white. So, as I said, you might lead more with being attention divergent and highly sensitive, but have some qualities of autism, or you may lead with autism and have some qualities of ADHD. I think this is really liberating, and I really have valued a lot of the stories that people have allowed me to use in my book as I've started to explore this territory. I might end. I'm going to try and keep this roughly to 20 minutes. Once I'm on a roll, isn't that easy for me. But I was working with a delightful client. All my clients are delightful, really. It's such a joy to do the work I do. And often, actually, we don't get to the neurodivergence because we're working with trauma. And I think trauma has to be dealt with first at one level. It's so deeply impactful on our sense of self. But, it's not one step at a time. If you think about that you've gone far enough in your trauma work that you start to see your neurodivergence, then that's another area for self-growth and feeling good about yourself and stopping masking, stopping trying to fit in with the neurotypical norm. So anyway, going back to my client who, in my opinion, and now hers, is clearly ADHD. She went along to her doctor, and the doctor had what I think is a very common response these days. It's like, oh, no, not another one. What is it? Is it COVID, or everyone's too anxious and stressed because of the world we live in? Well, yeah, COVID's had an effect, and most of us live lives that are too fast-paced, and there is more anxiety and depression and other mental health issues in our world for good reasons. However, that's not what we're talking about. And my client, who is very articulate and insightful and fortunately can hold her own position, said, without missing a beat to the doctor, or there's been my whole generation that's been simply missed as neurodivergent, largely because we're women. So, I'm with her. I think that's what's going on here. It's really hard to cram all these ideas into small podcasts. And in my natural state, once I warm up, I can be a blurter and I can be a crammer. I can want to squeeze far more than is reasonable into a space of time. One of the things that's done is lead me to be a chronic overfunctioner and driver. And of course, there are variations with ADHs as well, which I would like to talk about another time. However, if you listen to this and get a chance, I'd love you to read my book. I'd love feedback. You know, it's not, okay, we got this sorted out now. We're all on a journey of trying to understand it. However, to my mind, it's pretty clear that there have been various brain variations for good evolutionary reasons over the course of humanity. And that will definitely be my next podcast. And, you know, there's also reasons why we're having so much struggle in classrooms with neurodivergence. It's almost like, how come there's so many now? Well, I see it a different way. We're just emerging, especially those of us who've learnt to hide ourselves, and hiding, not feeling good enough, feeling ashamed, feeling too much, too intense, too different is never ever going to be good for your mental health. So I look forward to continuing to share my ideas and also interview others. I've done a couple with my partner who identifies as being on the autistic spectrum. I really encourage you, especially neurotypical people out there, if someone says, I think I might be, they'll probably say ADD because that's the language we use, or I might be autistic. I encourage people not to say I have autism or I have ADD. That's like I've got an illness. But if someone shares that with you, don't say things like, aren't we all on some kind of spectrum? Or no, that can't be you. You know, what's maybe unspoken, sometimes it is you're too normal. Or no, I just don't know why you would say that, because, you know, I know a real autistic person or a real ADD kid, and you're nothing like that. You don't get to define another person. If you're really interested, listen, ask questions, find out what gets them to think this might be true of them. Okay, I'm saying goodbye for now.